So good evening. Thanks so much for having me tonight. What I would like to do is talk for about 40 minutes and focus or explore rather what the role is of urban planning in the 21st century, but more specifically in the context of the global pandemic that we are in at the moment. We believe it's not enough anymore for a city to be efficient, but rather a city should be a home for its citizens and care for the health of its citizens. As you all know, and the reason why we're doing this online is that the world has changed. This is what our office usually looks like, or used to look like, up to about mid-March, and this is what sort of our regular life is at the moment. We're spending a lot of time in calls, as I'm sure do all of you, and trying to adjust to those situations, which don't necessarily make life and coordination and collaboration and creative processes any easier. We often, within the office, I'm looking after the urban design group, and we've got a sort of a whole team of experts from different backgrounds who help us to develop a lot of the ideas I'm putting forward tonight. And the things we usually talk about are all about people and public spaces and connectivity, restaurants, activity, vibrant lifestyles, etc. But really, what the virus has done it has challenged quite fundamentally all of those ideas, and our lifestyle has been impacted very directly by all of that. There's also been a few silver linings maybe with our cities that we suddenly found emptier. We found them much cleaner with the cleaner air all around us that I think a lot of people said they could smell and feel. They were wilder in some parts of the country. This is from Wales, where a few sheep took to town, but I also think they became friendlier. These moments where clearly we seek out interactions with other people as we're confined to our own spaces. And in many ways, we have changed the great indoors for the great outdoors, and people rediscovered the beauty and the fascination of outdoor spaces. And previously, I think where a lot of people were quite happy spending an evening in front of a digital device, I think now we're also have that longing to go outside and breathe the fresh air. And that's very much something we're able to observe across the globe. These are a couple of maps from CityLab, who asked people to draw their mental maps, the stories of their everydays. And the example at the left, obviously from London, somebody who lives between Regent's Park and Hampstead Heath, and clearly it's those two spaces that suddenly became the elements that defined his or her daily life. On the right, an example from San Francisco, where equally it's the large open spaces that dominate the map, and then these small pockets of the place where you can get these wonderful donuts or a cup of coffee or so along the route. And the same picture from Sydney to Washington, where really the green is what's dominating. But it's not all happy, as you know, and the challenge has also highlighted sort of structural inequalities in cities and fault lines that ultimately weaken and challenge our cities. And I think we, as the design industry, together with many other people, are all here and have a duty of care as to the citizens in those places. Now, looking back a little bit, this is not the first time that cities have been faced with challenges. Just to mention the cholera epidemics from the 1830s onwards in London, and at the time, people falsely thought that actually clean air was what was going to fix it for people. And interestingly, before 1840s, there were no public parks in Britain and in London, and the cholera epidemic ultimately driven by sort of individual who felt there was a need to act, managed to get 30,000 people to sign a petition for Victoria Park that opened in 1845. And after that, a succession of parks that we still cherish today, and very much became part of the fabric and what makes London this wonderful green city that we all enjoy. Another example was the Great Stink from 1858, and this came from the problem that ultimately the raw sewage was dumped into the rivers and ended up in the River Thames, and brought with it a whole myriad of waterborne diseases such as cholera and typhoid, and possibly because the river runs next to the Parliament. This got so bad in the summer of 1858 that the government decided to act and create the capital's first sewage system, which started construction shortly after and was opened in 1865 and completed by say 1875 by Battlejet. And interestingly, it was at the time sort of sized so big that we were still able to cope with a lot of the London growth. And it was not until 140 years later when we built the first major addition, which is the Thames Tideway, that runs basically follows the River Thames to avoid pumping raw sewage into the river. So all this, these initiatives from the Victorian age sort of brought us the hygienic city, which was very much about providing basic infrastructure and with it the physical well-being. But I think sort of 2 centuries on, maybe it's time to be more ambitious and think about the mental and the social well-being as well as the physical well-being as a way of framing the topic. What I'd like to do is just talk about 3 different scales now, from the city and the neighborhood, the street and the block, to illustrate a little bit what we mean with a caring city. London, as many cities around the globe, is very centralized, and that means that we've got places like Piccadilly Circus or the City of London, where a lot of activities sort of cluster together in a very tight space. There's a lot of benefit and sort of rationale behind it. It's economists describe this as the agglomeration benefits, where competitors seek out the proximity to other competitors because there's business benefits in it for them. But what happens ultimately is that as a city, we get a few major nodes of concentration of the workplace. And the map you're looking at the moment shows the concentration of employment in red, and then the predominantly residential areas in blue. And you can just about make out a sort of a little bit of a purple haze between those 2 zones, where the number of jobs and the number of residential density sort of is more balanced out. Out of the 6 million jobs in London, about 25% of those jobs are just within Westminster and the City of London, which is the area that you see in red. 500,000 of those jobs in the City of London alone. And naturally, in times where public transport has challenges in terms of its capacity, this concentration became now a challenge for places like that. In the theory of commuting and traveling, there's a name that often crops up, and it's Cesare Marchetti, who together with some other researchers sort of coined this idea of a time travel budget. And it was defined as roughly 30 minutes per direction that people are willing to travel. And this is something that was sort of observed both over time as well as over in different geographies. And what was interesting was that as the people were able to move more quickly, so as you went from walking to the horse or to a tram or a train, ultimately, the time budget sort of more or less stayed the same. But we were able to travel further, which meant that our cities got bigger and bigger and bigger. This is sort of what the Marchetti's constant is these days in these different cities, as they have much more information, and you see places like London, because of its large area, has slightly higher number than, for instance, New York, which has the same number of residents within half the landmass ultimately. But as I said, as we're challenged with the public transport, which isn't as doesn't have the same capacity that we used to have. A lot of cities are sort of uncovering or bringing back these older concepts, such as sort of the 15-minute cities, or other cities use the 20-minute city, right? Of how can we create cities where ultimately you can do things by walking and cycling, active modes of transport, which also promote a more healthy lifestyle. From a conceptual point of view, what that does is that we move from a very centralized model, which is the diagram on your left, to a more distributed model, which is a network of nodes, which creates ultimately a more robust structure in a city. And even if one node fails, the other nodes, the other places still hold it in place. If you look back again about 70 years to the Abercrombie plan of London, we also find references of that sort of notion of the small city within London, and this sort of famous drawings very nicely sort of captures the idea of how London is made up of a series of smaller settlements or villages that over time have grown together. And in its very center, we've got the city, and we've got the West End as the two main nodes that we recognize from the previous map. The blue dots you see on the map are actually the high streets at the time that Abercrombie had mapped out, and what you'll recognize if I'm turning on today's high streets is how a lot of those high streets didn't actually shift very dramatically, and over these decades of urban renewal and urban change still maintained themselves in these places. The high streets traditionally play a vital role in our urban fabric. In a joint research project by the Office of National Statistics and the Ordnance Survey, about 1,200 high streets were identified in London. About 25% of all businesses are registered on a high street, and almost 40% of all Londoners live within 3 minutes of a high street. But despite all these amazing statistics, we still see high streets across the country and across London that struggle and that suffer, and partly because of that sort of hyper-centralization that we talked about earlier, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of sort of the areas where we go to play and shop and sort of pursue leisure uses. So what does the current crisis mean? Is it also an opportunity maybe to rethink the high street and bring some life back into those places? This is Upper Street in Islington, and it was just one example to think about how can we maybe repurpose disused shops or so, and bring a new sort of lease of life into some of those places by putting in functions that are particularly needed in the times where we all can't travel to maybe the office that's half an hour tube ride away, and can we not work with the local fabric that already exists and take advantage of that and its places we can get to by walking and cycling, and through that again promote healthy behaviors and preventative care. The street is sort of the next scale. We will continue to move, whether we move to those local high streets or somewhere else. But the question is a little bit how we do that in the time where we're trying to avoid the crowds. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this comic, which I think really sort of sums up what the challenge is sometimes as a pedestrian in London or in any other city, where ultimately we are constrained to a fraction of the space that's given over to the roads and the cars. In London, within the area of the GLA, we roughly have a 2/3, 1/3 split of the movement space between cars and pedestrians. So only 1 in 3 square meters is for pedestrians, and I'm sure you've all had the situations over the last few months where you're walking on a narrow pavement and can sort of find yourself pushed into parked cars or so to give people space to pass you safely as the sort of the 2-meter rule was in place. And similarly, the green open spaces is another important aspect that we already mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And London is a very green city, and I think we're very lucky to be here. But it's also important to recognize that actually not all of that green space is accessible to everybody. Out of the about 880 square kilometers of green and open space in London, about a third of that, or more than a third, is residential gardens. So great for those who got it, less good for the other ones. And only roughly 1 in 4 square meters of that open space is public open space. Now, if you look around the world and see what other people have done, or what other cities have done, we find a myriad of examples from the temporary and sort of the guerrilla intervention all the way through to the more permanent ones. And I think examples like the Times Square or the Paris riverbanks have really shown how the transformations can start as a temporary installation, but then once people see benefits, and maybe the car lobby is sort of outmaneuvered, and people really see the advantage of having more accessible, more pedestrian space, and realize that the city doesn't die just because maybe one axis gets shut down or closed for the car. More recently, we also found sort of responses and sort of creative solutions to the challenges. Again, this is from early on in the pandemic in Auckland, where the pavements were widened temporarily to give people enough space to walk. We had widened bicycle lanes in Berlin, where again the city just with a bit of yellow paint doubled the cycle lane, and made it safer for people to cycle, because ultimately what we don't want is people just to jump back into their cars and fall back into that behavior. And this example is from Milan, where again the city started repainting areas of the inner city with widened walking and cycling tracks to try and respond. And I think the challenge ultimately will be how much of that are we able to keep, so how many of these temporary solutions will become permanent ones and have a long-lasting benefits on all of us who live and work in those cities. When we're looking at the slightly smaller scale, this is of a typical residential street in SW2. And again, we sort of find the same 2/3, 1/3 split between the space for the cars and the space for the pavements. But for a large part of the day, what these streets are effectively car parks, right? The residents want to have a space for their car. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, so I think as a way of sort of thinking how could we make a better space out of this? If one was to take the provided parking at the moment and put that into a stack like these that we know from Tokyo to New York, maybe that's a more efficient use of space, and we can transform something that looks like this at the moment into a space that's a true public space, and the true public realm. Again, an opportunity for people to be outside, an opportunity to integrate urban infrastructure from cycle parking all the way through to how we deal with the waste disposal, to deal with all the wheelie bins that sort of gather outside people's front gardens, which often aren't really gardens, but bin storage areas. This is very much focused on the residential street, and there's lots of other spaces, and there's lots of other people who use the city, and unfortunately the weather isn't always good in London. So this poor cycle courier, who's probably bringing somebody's lunch or dinner, is struggling through the rain. And London apparently had bike couriers since 1865 or so at least the oldest courier firm claims. The average bike courier does more than 90 kilometers per day. That's halfway across the M25. But we're lacking basic infrastructure. and particularly in the last 4 months again, where a lot of us relied increasingly on deliveries and getting food and things brought to our homes. There must have more and more of those, and the conditions, I'm sure, didn't get easier as we understand a lot of couriers have been denied sort of the basic use of services in restaurants because of fear of the spread of the virus. Looking back a little bit, there's another sort of unique London solution to some of those challenges, and very much driven by Lord Shaftesbury, who was a philanthropist, and under his initiative, 61 cabmen's shelters were built between 1875 and 1914, and as you can see, it wasn't the black cabs at the time, but it was horse-drawn carriages. But it was places where these men at the time, I guess, who were working there could go, could warm up, could protect from the rain, and maybe get a cup of coffee or some food. And only 13 of those still exist today in London. All of them have been Grade 2 listed, but it's still the place where the cabbies can go, shelter, grab a quick break, read the paper, or get a coffee for a pound. Another form of urban infrastructure, which again has been around since the Victorian times, were the public toilets that had been developed since 1850. And while these conveniences were a useful piece of infrastructure, it also has been noted that at the time of their introduction, they were only designed for male customers, because apparently the female, the other 50% of the population, didn't have much to do in cities, and we're glad that's changed. But what's also changed is the fact that that a lot of these toilets have since been closed and converted into all kinds of creative uses. But I think in times where we're asked to wash our hands and sort of maintain a heightened level of cleanliness, it seems to be a pity that we've lost a lot of that infrastructure. There's an app and a map for everything these days, and there's an app for finding a toilet, apparently not just in London, but in the whole country. And if you look at the density of the dots, we clearly can see that central London is quite well served. But as soon as you go outside, what's probably zone 1, the density of those conveniences drops quite dramatically. And also the other challenge, I think, is that a lot of these dots are part of a community toilet scheme, which I think is well intended, but is only operational when the businesses are open and during those business hours. And again, we're just coming out of a few months of a lot of restaurants and shops being closed, and with it, we've lost that sort of vital piece of infrastructure in our cities. Now, the third scale I'd like to just cover quickly is the urban block, and that's very much the scale at which we all sort of interact with the built environment, and we want to imagine what other spaces within the urban block could enable communities to interact and prosper. Images of rooftops and previously little used or loft spaces started to appear over the last few months as more and more people started to use these find alternative spaces to the gym, or maybe a quieter moment away from a busy flat share. And we also sort of discovered this phenomenon of the balcony spirit. People gathering outside as they sought these moments of interaction and seeing another friendly face, maybe, as a lot of people were sort of confined to their own four walls. And I think it's also quite heartening that, you know, where possible, these sort of private outdoor spaces became a way of linking and forging relationships. And I know myself from, you know, the sort of Thursday evening clap for the NHS, you suddenly perceive your neighborhood in a very different from a very different space than we used to. But in this crisis, community engagement has also provided mutual aid and solidarity to the ones who were lonely or the ones who needed help and were unable to access social care services, especially the most vulnerable, the children and the elderly. I'm just going to touch on three quick examples, and the first one, so from my home country. This is in Zurich, the Kalkbreite development developed in 24 by Müller Siglist Architekten. And what's interesting about that one is the really the model of how the development came about. It was developed by a cooperative, which is a very common format, and there's a policy environment in Switzerland that allows the cooperatives to work with the cities to get brownfield land from the city under sort of favorable development conditions, to then work together with the communities and develop ultimately not just flat, but also other types of residential spaces and amenities that are needed by the local residents and the local neighborhood. So in this case, it was really the focus of trying to bring in different types of care provision into the building, and you're looking at the ground first and upper floors on these three drawings. And what we find is that the most public forms of care are on the ground floor and very much targeted to serve the wider community that lives within the neighborhood. And as we move up through the levels, the care becomes more private and more tailored to the residents. So the upper floor we're showing there actually has a number of apartments that are built for the elderly, and even within those what's described as a cluster apartment, we're finding these special spaces of the stitching room. So again, a space where the residents can come together and share a cup of tea or a conversation, and not be sort of left alone within their spaces. And this is then sort of in the section as you traverse up the building, and really the whole building is set up to try and sort of draw you in through that space. There's actually a tram passing through on the ground floor, so that's why the courtyard is raised up with play facilities for the residents. There's a public cafeteria, as well as a number of spaces, such as an open living room in the library, where people can go and sort of break out from their own apartments, as well as communal laundry facilities. Another example is in Barcelona, and again, it's a cooperative housing project that was built together with the Barcelona municipality. The cooperative was able to get the land for 75 years, after which it falls back into the city's public housing stock. And in this space, the care is delivered as a sort of both a social and community facility, and that works both on the collective and the individual level. And what that means is that we've got a sort of community workspace on the ground floor. Again, people not being confined to their living rooms like me tonight when they have to work, but you got a space away from your own four walls, and the desk maybe to work, as well as this body care room on the second floor on the right hand diagram, which is able to provide care services, and it's linked to a guest room to provide additional flexibility. And you can see sort of the red threads that run through all those projects: the importance of the community spaces from the outside community space to the inner courtyard and the shared terrace. And again, that's what we also see on this last example in Melbourne, Nightingale One by Breathe Architects, which had this very public ground floor, and this photo is from the opening, so way before the COVID challenges. But even then, you can see how they sort of reclaimed what probably were parking spaces at the time, and used to sort of occupy that space as public space for people. Within the building, you've got what they describe as a public street, which is the corridor here. And again, it's got workspaces and community offices facility within the building. And then lastly, this rooftop, which is sort of accessible to all the residents of the building. So what now? It seems we are now experiencing the quiet before the storm of construction, and the Prime Minister has pledged to build our way back to health, with a focus on traditional infrastructure such as roads and broadband. Based on what we learned during the last 4 months, we think we need to be more ambitious and consider how we can build more caring cities, towns, and villages. This presents an opportunity to build transformative urban areas, especially as the world begins to build back with greater consciousness of the links between space and health. Our vision for a caring city is one with a decentralized and diffused network of care infrastructure, the hygienic infrastructure of the Victorian England that sanitized the air and the water needs to be matched by the caring infrastructure of the modern Elysian area. To sustain the qualities we discover in our communities and cities during the pandemic, we need the collaboration on all levels, from government to community organizations. Building a caring city is not just a job for a mayor or a lone designer. Rather, neighborhood groups, cultural organizations, and educational institutions are part of the answer in how we deal with challenges such as tackling loneliness, food poverty, and access to culture. A city where the residents care for each other, the environment, the community, and the city at large is, in my view, a better city. And I'm going to leave you just with a quote from our founder and chairman, that if you weren't an optimist, it would be impossible to be an architect. And I think that probably applies to many other design professions. And I definitely feel like that even though these are challenging times for all of us individually, but also for cities, I feel if we act in the right way, we can come back with better and more resilient cities. Thank you.
Bruno, thank you so much. Fantastic. Perhaps, great. Stop the screen sharing. We've got a question already, but I'm just going to ask a couple of questions and then open it out. So if anyone in the audience wants to ask something, then just notify me in the chat box. I was talking to a developer the other day who builds offices in central London, and he was saying that in the last 3 or 4 months, Zoom had made office developers as anxious as Amazon had made shopping center owners over the past decade. What do you see as the future for this very large quantity of office space that we've made in the center of London particularly, but in many cities, and that it would seem if there's talk of a kind of decline in commuting of as much as 20% after we're out of this situation, it would seem that there would be much less demand for it than there has been in the past. How do you see that building stock being adapted or transformed?
Yeah, I think we're still in a situation where we're sort of in the in-between of the initial shock and whatever, to use that term, of the new normal we'll end up with, right, or we'll settle in. I think the reality is that a lot of organizations realize that things are possible that they didn't think were possible back in February or March, probably, in terms of how the world and how all our professional lives sort of just ticked on, and we continue to do what we do. I still think it remains to be seen to what extent the office still will be sort of reoccupied. I do believe that even though that we can operate the way we operate at the moment, as I said at the beginning, I think means of collaboration, etc., aren't. We don't collaborate in quite the same way, the way we used to. I think so. I think people will go back. Let's see to what extent. Having said that, I think in general we always try and advocate for to build any kind of space in a way that allows you flexibility, right? So I think ultimately that's the best approach. I think there's been some successful conversions of office space in London just because of how the market's been driving. Yeah, it's a hit for many developers. I think, you know, we probably have to wait another 6 or 12 months to see where we land and how we all sort of move forward in our professional lives.
And can I ask you just to sort of, you talked about lots of different scales, but I wonder if I could ask you to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about the cities in relation to one another. You know, particularly, you know, in the UK, where we have this incredibly London-centric kind of structure, much to which really isn't necessarily great for many of the other cities in the UK. Do you see that dynamic shifting as people potentially realise that they're able to live away from central London and still, you know, contribute to a kind of professional life?
I think there is an increased debate around where you live. I think going back to your first question, how often you have to go to the office, and again, you know, that notional travel budget, right? And if you have to do a journey once a day versus, you know, twice a week, you might be able to choose where you live based on other criteria. I think as always, there's I mean, there's positive force which might help to sort of, you know, balance the urban network better, and I think there's, you know, sort of examples on the continent, in the rural gebiets, or in Netherlands, where sort of these city landscapes connected with, you know, good public transport, etc., work incredibly successfully, and again, you know, have been very resilient. Because they probably didn't have the challenges of you know, 8 million people who also operate as one engine. I think how quickly these changes will come remains to be seen, because I think some of those decisions happen on a sort of slightly slower timeline.
We've got a question from Katharina. Katharina, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to ask it yourself. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Katrina Audrey from Indonesia. I would like to ask you a question. The capital city of my country, Jakarta, which we all know that the population density is really thick and has a lot of problems such as floods during rainy season, traffic jam, and now which happen in all around the world, COVID-19, and more problem to the city. In your opinion and professional perspective, what kind of approach should be taken to solve that kind of problem? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a very big challenge, which I probably can't answer in a few sentences. I think in a lot of the strategies I discussed work. Are applicable to many cities and urban environments across the world. I think ultimately, you know, solving the challenges of major cities in countries that are still urbanizing at the rapid rate is so much more difficult because of that still growing population, and you know, providing the infrastructure and the sort of the sustainable planning principles to deal with or mitigate the flood issues, and then providing the infrastructure, public transport infrastructure, to deal with traffic jams are sort of well tried and tested. I think the challenge is that some of those solutions are being challenged by the virus itself at the moment, such as public transportation. So I think the only thing I maybe can say is that, you know, we in the West had 200 years to develop the majority of our cities, and we've made a lot of mistakes in those 200 years. But that slow pace sort of allowed us to realize the mistake and fix them. And, you know, the sort of car-driven infrastructure in many cities is just one example where we've spent a lot of money building double-decker and triple-layer highways and flyovers from the UK all the way through to North America and Mexico. And then we spent a lot of money taking these infrastructures all down. So I think maybe learning from our mistake is maybe one thing I'd like to suggest.
We've got a question from Tom Benson. Tom.
Hi. Well, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was great. I'm actually signing in from Cambridge in Massachusetts. So it's nice to have a small world these days with Zoom. But my question was more about your team, and I wondered what response, or if you've been working on any COVID responses, short term, long term, in terms of like urban planning. I saw that Foster's have been doing some kids drawings, but I wondered maybe on the design side if there was also a response.
Yeah, it's definitely. Thank you for the question. There's definitely it's definitely a hot topic with a lot of our clients who either are in the middle of a master plan or at the beginning, who want to make sure that that we integrate what we learn. I think a lot of the knowledge is very much it's sort of developing field, right? I think we did put out an article a couple of months ago now, with some initial ideas, some of which I've sort of shown you today. But naturally, I think it's not the challenge is that ultimately we don't have a fixed problem, right? That the problem or the challenge itself is moving, and it sort of goes one way on one day, and then it seems to come back and haunt you again. So the challenge is we're not quite sure what exactly we're planning for. But I think the one thing that I sort of feel positive about is ultimately, I think a lot of the solutions I talked about today and we talked about with our clients are ideas that sort of fall into the bucket of good urban design, right? So promoting your local neighborhood, having decent forms of public realm, both in terms of design quality and in terms of the open spaces. They're all things that I think we would like to promote anyway. I think it's issues around the infrastructure that are probably slightly more challenging, and I think we're still to find out how exactly, what the answer to some of those challenges might be.
Thank you. Well, I also had one more question, if you did not mind, but it was actually based on the time budget. I've been doing some research on there and analysing 270 cities in China, and we've actually started to prove empirically the polycentric model of cities. So actually away from the centralized network, but not the decentralized, but actually polycentric. And it was actually one interesting case study was actually London itself, and it is a very centralized network. And do you feel as though in the long term with rapid urbanization that this needs to actually change to have more of these nodes popping up around the outer of London so it can
I think there's, I think there's been, drives to sort of create more alternative nodes, back in the 1970s and 80s with Canary Wharf, right? As one example, I think London as a city struggled to develop many other nodes with of similar strength, which again I think it's a challenge in a context where we have such successful central city nodes. But I mean, I think from my professional point of view, I think it wouldn't be a bad thing if we had a more distributed map of employment opportunities, because as the current situation shows, I think sort of the hyper concentration is not without challenges.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, then I think I will just unmute everyone for a round of applause for a fantastic talk.
Thank you very much.